This is part of the program, but it's also its own panel on community-based science in the Arctic. And it's co-sponsored along with the law school and inspired by Joe Demento's putting together of this entire program. It's co-sponsored by the Newkirk Center for Science and Society, of which I'm the director. I'm Simon Cole. And the Center for Unconventional Security Affairs and its director, Richard Matthew, who's here in the front. So our first speaker today, we have 5 speakers. We'll have a break after the first 3 with about 15 minutes for discussion prior to a coffee break. So we're going to have the first 3 speakers present, and we hope you can hold questions for those first 3 speakers to that question period at the end. Our first speaker will be Elizabeth Mendenhall. She's from the Department of Political Science at Johns Hopkins University. She has a bachelor's degree in political science and philosophy from Kansas State University, and she's now a PhD student at Johns Hopkins. She's a member of Phi Beta Kappa and has won numerous university and department fellowships and awards, and her research is in international relations and climate change, with a particular interest in the Arctic and Antarctic politics. Her paper, which would be a broad overview to start us off, is called Social Understandings of the Arctic Domain. Beth Mendenhall.
Thank you very much, Simon. I'm really appreciative of the opportunity to speak to you all today on the topic of how human communities generally are coming to grips with the material transformation occurring in the Arctic as a result of climate change. So I had intended to start with a review of the different ways we define the Arctic region, but Brian Israel did a good job reviewing that yesterday, so I'll only make 2 additional points. The first is that the fact that we have all these different definitions of the boundary of the Arctic region is an example of how our concept of the region is inherently unsettled or contested. The second point I'll make is that 2 of these definitions, the tree line and the isotherm, may actually change as a result of global warming, as the trees grow in different places and as temperature changes. So this is a preview of my presentation. It is in 3 parts. In the first part, I'll review historical narratives of the Arctic, how we used to understand what the region is and why it's distinct. These are important because they provide the threads of meaning which are often drawn upon in contemporary conversations about the Arctic. The middle part of the presentation is more about the science of the changing Arctic and how the melting ice cap is having reverberations on ecological and human communities in the Arctic region. And the third part of the presentation is where I actually start to talk about the social understandings of the Arctic, and I'll review 5 dominant clusters of metaphor that are often used, especially in popular media, to explain what exactly the new Arctic is as a concept of the region. So this is the political scientist in me trying to make explicit my conceptual foundations. So it's my belief that the material context of the Arctic, its geophysical properties, its ecological properties, are an important influence on this contested area of representation of the new region. So I'm most interested in the first part of this diagram because I believe that the material context shapes the way we represent the region in 2 main ways. The first is that accumulation of scientific knowledge about the geophysical Arctic provides fodder for meaning making that goes on here. Now there are lots of other different things that affect the different images, narratives, and metaphors that we have about the Arctic, but the material context is an important shaper of what we can say when we're talking about the Arctic. The second important relationship there is that the material context channels our experience of the Arctic in particular ways. For example, we can't have the experience of transpolar shipping, of taking that trip in a ship, unless the ice cap actually melts. This is important because of this part of the diagram. The way we talk about, understand, and orient ourselves towards the Arctic determines the way we behave there, the policies we have about the Arctic, our practices in the Arctic. So one caveat, unfortunately, I'm exactly not talking about the permanent participants in the Arctic Council. I separate these narratives and representations into the dominant and the marginalized understanding of the new Arctic. The dominant narrative tends to be an external perspective, one of my arguments in favor of the external perspective being the dominant perspective is that historically an external subarctic perspective is more likely to be documented, and those documents are more likely to be circulated. Now this is of course changing as the perspective of indigenous Arctic communities becomes more visible, more widely known and circulated, but I'm mostly focusing on the dominant narratives as they have existed historically and as they exist in popular media today. So now we're into the historical narratives about the Arctic section of the presentation. Our experience with the Arctic up until basically the 20th century was mostly about spreading Christianity and clubbing seals. Sustained exploration really didn't get underway until the age of discovery, when we started being interested in looking for a northwest or a northeast passage. And it was sort of limited to exploration in certain parts of the Arctic by certain peoples that were interested in the Arctic. And though we were exploiting the resources, it was mostly around the margins. So our representations, our early representations of the Arctic in maps tended to look something like this. This is a 1606 map drawn by Gerard Mercator of the Arctic region, and there's a couple of things that you can note. The symmetry of these supposed Arctic landmasses, the way they seem to be a void, that there's a ring of mountains on the outside, and this exciting mystery thing in the center that sort of represents the unknown about the crux of the Arctic as a region. 40 years later, we get a map like this, which shows the Arctic as literally boundless. There are no bounds across that upper region of the Arctic. Again, it's representing the region as sort of a boundless, infinite void of the unknown. So this is the Spitsbergen archipelago. These early explorations, which were documented in travelogues and sort of spread popularly among subarctic populations, represented the region as harsh and inaccessible. It also described the region as a wondrous, sublime place, a realm of masculine adventure and romance. Eventually, we started to get scientific stations established in the Arctic. This is an 1885 sort of exhaustive list of all the scientific stations. There wasn't a whole lot of systematic data collection going on here, but we did discover important things like there is no landmass in the Arctic, and the Arctic Ocean is fairly deep in places. Just to reinforce the idea that the Arctic is a realm of masculine adventure, the early explorers, they weren't all Norwegians, but a lot of them were Norwegians. This guy was an American. But you can see that documenting their travels and spreading it around sort of reinforced this idea that the Arctic was a place for adventure and for challenges, sort of an antagonistic human-nature relationship. Now, those ideas of a foreboding north were totally different than the indigenous perspectives. Now, we know that indigenous communities have lived in the Arctic for thousands of years, and for them, the Arctic was a familiar and stable place where they experienced abundance. When the early explorers came into contact with indigenous communities, they thought, well, these are nomadic populations, so they must be deprived. They must be experiencing scarcity. But because of accumulated local knowledge about the Arctic, they could show up in certain places where they knew dense aggregations of animals that they relied on for food would appear. So for indigenous populations, the North was very, very different than for explorers at the time. This is just a map of populations within the Arctic. I prefer this one actually because it reveals that even though there are a lot of cross-border connections between Arctic communities, that they do separate into different cultural and linguistic groups. So there is some significant degree of fragmentation among indigenous Arctic communities. All right, turning to the material transformation of the Arctic region, we've recently started to see an increase in images like this. This is obviously a satellite image of the Arctic, and it certainly reinforces the idea that it's sort of a boundless, pristine, harsh void. But images like this started to reveal more and more the macro processes and sort of the regional connections of the Arctic as a whole, as opposed to just limited experiences of individuals going there and reporting on what they saw. So you've all probably seen this map. We know that 2007 was sort of a watershed year for the decreasing ice cap. But one thing that's often overlooked is that the ice cap it's not just decreasing in extent, but it's also significantly thinning. And this is important because it makes the remaining ice less stable and less resilient. It makes it more likely to break up quickly. It has effects on the relationship between predator and prey for animals that live on top of the ice. Some of the animals rely on piercing the ice to get from predator to prey. This makes the ice easier to pierce. The changes occurring in the Arctic as a result of the melting ice cap are so significant that oceanographers and other Arctic scientists tend to refer to it as a state change. It's a total transformation. However, although we know that the Arctic is changing significantly, it's frequently difficult to discuss how it is changing because in a lot of cases we lack scientific baseline data. So we can't say how the Arctic is changing now relative to 20, 30, 50 years ago in a lot of cases because we just don't have that data. It's also the case that regional scale data has only recently begun to be accumulated. It wasn't until the mid-1990s that we started using satellite data to talk about the climate patterns in the Arctic as a whole. So the next series of slides are a bunch of pictures demonstrating how the melting ice cap is affecting the Arctic environment. So this is also on the Spitsbergen archipelago, and this is an area of the ice sheet that has experienced a 25-fold increase in movement of the ice flow. And as a result of this rapid expansion in the movement of the ice because of melting, it's no longer a smooth surface the way it used to be in many places. There are deep crevasses, which obviously change the environment for animals that are living on or relying on animals that live on the surface of the ice. It also significantly matters when and how much the ice starts to break up, the ice cap starts to break up, especially for animals that rely on the ice but cannot live under the ice cap, like these narwhals here. Many animals that live on the ice, like the polar bear, are obviously used to swimming, but less ice for less portion of the year means that animals like the polar bear spend more time exerting calories swimming and less time gaining calories by hunting. So it results in a general increase in the amount of stress and anxiety experienced by animals that rely on the ice cap. Animals like the walrus are also interested in what's happening here because for them, they use these big chunks of ice that may not last as long as they used to or may not be in the same places that they used to float over their preferred feeding grounds. So these walruses here are floating over clam beds at the bottom of the ocean, and they use this as a place to rest, which is especially important when they have little baby walruses. Narwhals, you're all probably familiar with, those tusks get up to 10 feet long, very interesting, which was an early reason why explorers went to the Arctic because there was a raging market for unicorn tusks, which is what they mistook this as. They're a very specialized animal. They don't migrate in and out of the Arctic. They live in the Arctic year-round. And they do things like use visual cues to navigate. So as the sea level rises and as shorelines begin to erode, the things that they can use as visual cues or that they have been using will change. They're also increasingly subject to predation by killer whales, who were documented in the Arctic for the first time in 2012. So now they have a new predator to deal with. This represents the Arctic food chain, and it's very complicated, but I only want to focus on one part of it, which is up here, the ice algae and the phytoplankton. These are the marine micro-autotrophs that are the base of the Arctic food chain. One thing, oh, here they are. They live in these little sort of crevices in the ice at the bottom layer of the ice. Something unique about the Arctic ecosystem is it's one of the most temporally pulsed ecosystems in the world. In other words, this is from data from Greenland. The ice algae blooms first, and the sequence of blooming and reproduction and predator-prey relationships all follows the ice algae. So how long the ice lasts when it starts to melt is extremely important for when ice algae blooms and the rest of the food chain can benefit. So just looking at these top four lines here, because this is something more about the effects of global warming, you can see that the further north you go, the more important the ice algae bloom is for setting off the phytoplankton bloom and zooplankton blooms that occur afterwards. So the timing of the ice melt is extremely important for the entire Arctic ecosystem because it matters for the first step in sort of feeding relationships. So now I'm going to talk about positive feedback loops in the Arctic. So a positive feedback loop is a process that accelerates itself. And there's multiple potential positive feedback loops for global warming in the Arctic. The first one you're probably familiar with is albedo, and it's represented by the difference in color between the surface of the ice and the surface of this meltwater pond in Greenland. The surface of the meltwater pond is going to absorb much more of the sun's energy as opposed to reflect it back the way that the surface of the ice does. This is especially concerning when you compare the albedo between the ice cap and the open ocean. The more open ocean there is for longer portions of the year, the more energy is absorbed from the sun and the more localized warming you see. This is also important on the Arctic coastlines. This is the Alaska's North Slope in 2007. However, this is not a true color image, so you can't really compare the green to the blue of meltwater ponds. But this represents another potential positive feedback loop in the Arctic that's associated with the melting of permafrost. When permafrost melts, it changes the structure of the soil substructure, and it also potentially releases large amounts of methane, which are an important greenhouse gas. This is called thermokarst. It's what happens when the permafrost melts, and it was totally unheard of in Alaska until 2003, when they started to be noticed and documented. And this represents a significant change in the structure of the tundra, but also a significant release of methane. These are spruce trees in Alaska, for the first time experiencing the ravages of the bark beetle, which is a warmer weather parasite. Changes in vegetation affect CO2 levels in two ways. The first is, as the trees die, they obviously absorb less CO2. And the second is, in 2008, for the first time, there was a forest fire documented in the Western Arctic. The drier and warmer the habitat for the trees, the more likely forest fires are to happen and release more carbon. Oh, I wanted to have a slide about the ocean circulation, layering, and mixing in the Arctic Ocean, but I only have half an hour, and that was going to take a long time to explain. But suffice it to say that as the ice cap melts, more fresh water is released and there's less refreezing, that there could be potentially significant changes in the way that the Arctic Ocean water is layered and mixed. This is not a positive feedback loop, the Arctic Oscillation, but it's a climatological pressure relationship between the Arctic climate and the climate in North America and Northern Europe. And changes in the Arctic Oscillation pattern as a result of warming in the Arctic have already been blamed for decreased precipitation in the Mediterranean and the Middle East, which just goes to show that what happens in the Arctic has extreme external consequences for weather. You saw this one yesterday. This is just to demonstrate that there are multiple pathways of pollution into the Arctic. One that's significant and often overlooked, I think, is the drainage basins of the 6 great Arctic rivers. These pick up all kinds of agricultural and industrial runoff and bring them north to the Arctic Ocean. So this is the last slide on this section of the presentation. And I want to demonstrate two things. So this slide is about the reverberations of ecosystem changes on Arctic populations. And there's some pluses and minuses that I'll talk about in the later slides. But two things to point out is that it all starts with the ice cap melting and then has these reverberations on other parts of Arctic communities. And secondly, that accumulated knowledge about the local environment that indigenous populations use to track the animals, to know where it's safe to travel on the ice cap, that kind of knowledge is becoming less and less adequate as ecosystems change as a result of the melting ice cap. So even the indigenous populations that have accumulated local knowledge and lots of experience in the Arctic region are experiencing a kind of disorientation in the way they relate to the region, much like subarctic populations are. So, the effects of climate change are melting the ice cap quickly, and they're impacting the ecosystems. And as a result, people are increasingly asking themselves these questions. How is the new Arctic connected with global climate relationships? How is the new Arctic still distinct from the rest of the world? Where is it going? How should we orient towards this? So, I posit that there's a general search going on for a concept of the new Arctic. And when we're describing what the new Arctic is, where it's going, we draw on a lot of different things. And there are powerful interested actors who are trying to control the conversation and present their own images of what the Arctic is. But it's part of my argument that scientific knowledge plays an important role in shaping the way we understand the new Arctic. both because it unsettles old ideas. We know now that we can't think of the ice cap as permanent and stable. But also, like I said, it channels experience and it provides fodder for new threads of meaning when we're talking about the new Arctic as a concept. So back to this slide. What I'm talking about is going on here. I'm next going to review 5 major clusters of meaning, clusters of metaphors that we use to describe the new Arctic. And I'm going to evaluate their congruence with what we know about the material context, the geophysical and ecological changes occurring in the Arctic. And I'll just reiterate the point that this is important because the way we think about the Arctic and orient ourselves towards it has an important effect on our policies and practices towards and in the Arctic. These are the places I looked for a new Arctic concept. There are lots of conversations of the Arctic, about the Arctic, as you know, especially occurring here this weekend. But I'm more interested in the dominant popular public narrative, the one that is more widely held and not held necessarily by specialists or experts in the Arctic. Here's an example of a powerful interested actor, the Shell Oil Company, drawing on historical narratives about the Arctic to represent its own preferred image of what is happening there. This is a realm of masculine adventure. Shell asking the polar bears to sacrifice for our SUVs. Okay, so these are the metaphors. I know, there's a whole series of Shell advertisements. I just picked out 2. And these kinds of advertisements are appearing in places like Time magazine. They're clearly trying to control part of the conversation. So the 5 metaphors I identified overlap a lot, but I tried to maintain a criteria of coherence. The cluster of representations of the Arctic has to answer these kinds of questions. What should we do? What should we expect? What's happening? They all have in common the fact that they're future-oriented, which is an important point because the future is inherently more uncertain than the present or the past, so there's a lot of wiggle room for describing what the Arctic is and where it's going. So the first one is the Arctic is a victim of climate change. And all the quotes included in these next slides do have references, but I can't memorize all of them, so I'm only going to share a few of them with you. This description of the Arctic as environmentally sensitive comes from Orrin Young. The description of the Arctic is under threat, that's Greenpeace. And National Geographic went so far as to describe the Arctic region as in a death spiral. This image of the Arctic represents it as sort of a symbol of the destruction of overconsumption and rapacious resource extraction. And all these representations are paired with images. So sometimes the Arctic is described as an entire region that is a victim, but more often there's a face attached. Frequently charismatic megafauna like the polar bear are used as the classic victim of climate change. And this is an effort to subjectify the region so that we can empathize with it. I mean, that Arctic fox is staring right at you. And that's meaningful for representing the Arctic in a particular way. This project by Greenpeace is described as symbolizing an emotional appeal for people to pay more attention to the Arctic. The indigenous communities in the Arctic are often portrayed as, or sometimes portray themselves as, victims of global warming. The Many Strong Voices Partnership is an organizational connection between, I believe it's the Inuit Circumpolar Council, I'm not sure if other indigenous organizations are a part of it, but in the small island developing states. And they're saying we need to get together and represent our interests collectively because we are the victims of climate change.
The Samis were on it for a while too.
Oh, okay. Oh, and this is from their Portraits of Resilience campaign, which was released by the Many Strong Voices Partnership. All right, this victim image captures a lot. Captures that there are profound consequences of the melting ice, that there are a lot of external causes with regional, local consequences. But I think it misses the possible benefits associated with the melting ice cap. There might actually be a total increase in biotic productivity in the Arctic. There are some social and economic benefits to local communities. And it also overlooks the fact that the Arctic is in significant ways an engine of climate change. It is causing global warming in a way that this image does not capture. So a couple of the beneficiaries of melting ice caps. Now, I'm certainly not denying that there are lots of disadvantages and negative consequences for Arctic communities of global warming and the associated changes in the local ecosystem. But this is an example of a group of Nanette herders who have a new deal with Gazprom facilities where they no longer have to herd their reindeer hundreds of miles to market. They just herd them to the local Gazprom facility and sell the meat there, which they're describing as an economically beneficial new relationship. Development also brings more infrastructure, more educational opportunities, so there are some benefits. A beneficiary, another charismatic megafauna, the killer whale, as I already mentioned, has an extended range, has new prey populations. So the Arctic as a victim image kind of overlooks a lot of the disadvantages, but also benefits of the melting ice cap. The next image is the Arctic as a test case, either a test case for how we deal with global warming or a test case for global governance generally. The barometer, that's from a former president of the Inuit Circumpolar Council. This description of the Arctic as an important laboratory, that comes from Scott Borgerson in The Economist. Poster child, I added that one because I heard it in Catherine's presentation yesterday. Governance compass, that's from the Arctic Governance Project. And once in a lifetime opportunity, that's from Foreign Affairs. So you can see that this is a pretty prominent metaphor of the new Arctic that's circulating in lots of different places. This sort of represents a liberal optimism about our ability to have progress and to cooperate for mutual benefit. So no real images for this, but this I think represents the fact that the test case image is asking whether or not we'll pay attention, whether or not we'll act, and whether or not we'll do the right thing. So it does capture the fact that if we can't cooperate on environmental issues in the Arctic, then we don't have much of a chance to have successful cooperation in other areas necessarily. But it misses the fact that the Arctic is an extremely distinct region and therefore might serve as a poor test case for other environmental challenges or other global governance issues because of the specificity of the region, the associated challenges. There's nowhere else in the world where you get the darkness and sunlight throughout the year that you get in the Arctic. So the third image you're all familiar with, I've heard it mentioned several times in the last day and a half, is the Arctic as a gold rush. It's very pervasive and visible. Arctic treasures, that comes from a recent headline in the New York Times. The silver lining, that's from the Telegraph. This image recognizes that there are downsides to global warming, but says, hey, we have something to be excited about, these new opportunities for economic exploitation. Usually when this metaphor is used, it's included alongside a laundry list of different resources in the Arctic that are described as relatively untouched. This is Shell rushing to the Arctic before they're ready to get the gold. This is the Kuluk. It is a mobile drilling platform, and it's not supposed to be here because in this image it has run aground as a result of breaking its tow line multiple times on the way back to Seattle.
That's called conquering the Arctic.
Yeah, one shoreline at a time. There's a lot going on in this image. But the main point I want to make is that a lot of the natural resources, especially mineral and fossil fuel resources, are concentrated in the Russian Arctic, and that they're a significant portion of Russia's overall fossil fuel and mineral reserves, as represented by this rainbow-like figure here. This image definitely captures the fact that there are potential benefits of the melting ice, and that multinational corporations are very, very interested in new opportunities in the Arctic. But as we've mentioned a few times recently, that it really overstates the time horizons for access, and it doesn't recognize the fact that some of the resources in the Arctic are renewable resources that need to be cooperatively managed and may call for restraint. And it also totally overlooks the role of indigenous communities in economic exploitation of new Arctic opportunities and what sort of relationship would exist between those communities, states, and the multinational corporations interested in making a profit. The next image comes from the Cold War, the idea that the Arctic is a strategic arena. Time magazine, in that Who Owns the Arctic 2007 cover, said, who's going to win the world's new great game? The rest of these quotes come from an edited volume on Arctic security by James Kraska, and each of the different chapters was supposed to represent a different perspective of a different Arctic country, and all of them used language like this. So it focuses on the routes, hiding places, and early warning opportunities of the Arctic. And I think it's driven by stories about Arctic nationalism and Arctic remilitarization, which are especially strong in these countries. And this strategic arena image appears less in text in popular media, but in my opinion is very evident in maps of the Arctic region. So this map here highlights the political features of the Arctic region, but notice how inconspicuous the ice cap is on this map. Maps like this take the idea that the Arctic is an empty void, and they redescribe that void as a strategic arena of competition. This map, remember yesterday when Michael Byers was saying that there are no longer any significant territorial disputes in the Arctic? This map definitely disagrees and numbers all of them. Ironically, they leave out the Beaufort Sea, which is the one that hasn't been negotiated. But this map also represents the militarization going on in the Arctic. And although in terms of total military capacity, it may be insignificant, when Norway does something like move its military headquarters north of the Arctic Circle to here, it's noticed and commented upon in the popular media. You know, this image, which reinforces the strategic arena concept. This concept does get at the true geographic proximity of great powers when you look north. It does get at the role of nationalism in Arctic policymaking, but it overlooks a lot, especially any non-security imperative or value, especially the instability and uncertainty associated with the melting ice. It overlooks all of these actors, so clearly it's missing a lot of what's going on in the new Arctic. Thank you. The fifth image is the Arctic as a pivot area. This is Scott Borgerson in The Economist again, describing it as an epicenter of industry and trade. This emphasizes the importance of the Arctic's geographical location and envisions a more cooperative politics of mutual advantage, helpfully represented by the UN logo here, where the Arctic is literally in the middle. It is the pivot of the globe. Also represented in maps like this is a projection of the ideal transport routes from the years 2040 to 2060. A map like this released by Russia Today, which I find it really funny that the Suez route is in a bright red line compared to the more friendly green line of the Northern Sea route. The pivot area image is also associated with the idea that increasing transportation in the Arctic will lead to regional development. So articles that talk about, or that forward the pivot area representation tend to include pictures like this of a new housing development in Greenland. This is an image of servers in Sweden above the Arctic Circle from a new company that calls itself the Node Pole. And the Arctic provides favorable siting locations for servers because of the consistently low temperature. And even a company like Facebook is getting in on it. This is their server center in northern Sweden. This image captures the fact that the Arctic does represent a spatial extension resource, insofar as going through the Arctic is extremely valuable. It also captures the role of non-Arctic states in defining the region's future, also shipping companies. But it definitely misses the long time horizon for affordable shipping, because it's not just important when the ice melts and is replaced by open ocean, but a key factor is whether or not insurance companies will reflect this in their rates for transpolar shipping. It also totally neglects the Arctic ecology and other obstacles to accessibility like low population density, lack of deep water ports. And so basically it's a little bit too optimistic about the Arctic becoming the epicenter of industry and trade in the global economy. So my conclusion is that scientists are not going to determine for sure, inevitably, the way we understand the new Arctic. But there's an important role for accumulation of scientific knowledge in producing authoritative accounts and being deployed against metaphors like the gold rush or the strategic arena or the Arctic as a victim. So there's no guarantee that scientists will define the new Arctic, but the competition between scientific claims and scientific and non-scientific claims and the way they can be wielded against the images created by powerful interests like Shell is very important for determining which of these images wins out and how we define the Arctic region. Representations do tend to settle. We're currently in a period of unsettled representations because we're still coming to grips with how quickly the ice cap is melting and the reverberations that will have on the rest of Arctic ecology and Arctic populations. So that's it.